For 41 days, the people guarding our airports and borders have worked for $0. Yesterday, Thursday, March 26th, the House finally moved to change that with a vote to get those paychecks out. But while that was happening on one side of the Capitol, the Senate spent their afternoon locked in a debate over whether voters should be forced to provide photocopies of their birth certificates just to cast a ballot.
It's a striking contrast, Paige. 41 days of zeroed-out bank accounts for federal employees. To put that in perspective, that's now eclipsed the record-breaking 2018-2019 shutdown. For the thousands of TSA agents and Border Patrol officers, the math yesterday wasn't about policy. It was about survival.
The transcript from the floor shows this wasn't exactly a quiet, procedural afternoon. The rhetoric was heavy with the weight of that timeline. Since we have a bit more room to explore the nuances today, I want to look at the specific language used, because the definition of what and who is essential shifted significantly during the debate.
Right. And we'll also look at the Senate side, where the SAVE Act is still the primary friction point. I'm interested in the pushback from the Democrat from Illinois, Senator Richard Durbin. He brought up some data points regarding rural document access that really complicate the simple fix narrative being pushed by the Republican from Utah, Senator Mike Lee.
We'll get into all of that, plus some of the smaller details that usually get buried when the headlines are this big. Let's start with the mechanics of that House vote and the pressure cooker that led up to it.
Let's do it.
This is the 41-day Payday Standbill. The House floor yesterday, Thursday, was dominated by a series of high-volume speeches that didn't just touch on immigration policy as a broad concept, but focused on the very specific, very grim details of what's happening inside federal detention centers. It started with Representative Alma Ansari, a Democrat from Arizona, who took the well to discuss the death of Emmanuel Damas. He was a 56-year-old Haitian asylum seeker who died on March 2nd while in the custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, at the Florence Correctional Center in her home state.
And the details Ansari brought to the record were striking. We're talking about a man who reportedly died from a toothache, or more accurately, the complications from one. According to the accounts Ansari shared, which she gathered from oversight visits and interviews with other detainees, Mr. Damas complained of tooth pain for weeks. It eventually escalated into severe swelling. She described his face as being swollen to the size of a potato, which led to him being unable to walk or speak, and eventually he succumbed to septic shock and respiratory failure.
It's the kind of medical progression that feels like it belongs in a history book about the 19th century, not a modern federal facility. But this case has become the center of a much larger legislative storm. Mr. Damas is the 10th person to die in ICE custody so far in 2026. If you look at the numbers, we're only 3 months into the year, and we're already on a pace that would dwarf the 32 deaths recorded in 2025.
Since we have a bit more room to look at the context here, it's important to look at why this specific case is triggering such a sharp response from the progressive wing of the House. It's not just the death itself. It's the environment surrounding the oversight of it. Representative Ansari mentioned that when she tried to conduct an oversight visit at the Florence facility on March 13th, she wasn't just met by ICE officials. She was met by private counsel for CoreCivic.
That's a detail that stands out in the transcript. For those who don't follow the contracting world, CoreCivic is one of the largest private prison operators in the country. They run the Florence Center under a federal contract. Ansari noted that there was extreme reluctance from the private lawyers when she asked basic questions about medical staffing and the timeline of Mr. Damas's care. She told the House yesterday, Thursday, that she was initially denied the ability to speak with other detainees during that first visit.
Which raises the question of where the line is between a private corporation's proprietary information and a member of Congress's constitutional right to oversight of federal programs. If the government is paying a private company to house asylum seekers, does that company get to shield its operations from the people writing the checks? That's the argument Ansari is making by calling the system lawless. She's pointing to the presence of private lawyers during a congressional visit as evidence that the system is designed to protect the contractor, not the people in custody.
The timeline for Mr. Damas is also something the record sheds light on. He arrived in the United States legally in 2024. He was seeking asylum from the instability in Haiti. His detention stemmed from an arrest in Boston in September 2025, following a well-being check. He was eventually transferred to Arizona. Representative Ayanna Pressley, a Democrat from Massachusetts, also spoke on the floor yesterday, Thursday, because Damas was a resident of her district in the Massachusetts 7th.
Pressley's account added a layer of institutional critique. She noted that while Damas was in custody, he pleaded for necessary medical care for a toothache, which she termed a basic human right. The record shows that he reported the pain on February 12th. He reportedly received ibuprofen, but not a dental referral or antibiotics until much later, after the infection had already entered his bloodstream. By the time he was hospitalized at Honor Health Scottsdale Osborne Medical Center, it was too late.
And this is where the policy debate gets very tense. This isn't happening in a vacuum. We are currently in the middle of a government shutdown that has lasted over 40 days. The primary sticking point is Department of Homeland Security funding. On one side, you have Republicans who are demanding more money for ICE detention beds, pushing the capacity toward a record 71,000. On the other side, you have members like Ansari and Pressley, who are now saying they will be a hell no on any bill that includes ICE funding.
It's a complete breakdown of the traditional bargaining process. Usually, you'd see a trade-off. We'll give you the detention beds if you give us a path to citizenship, or some other policy win. But the rhetoric yesterday, Thursday, suggests that for a growing number of Democrats, ICE has become an untamed agency, to use the words of Representative Adriano Espaillat, a Democrat from New York.
Espaillat's speech was particularly sharp. He's the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and he spent his 5 minutes on the floor yesterday, Thursday, arguing that ICE should be dismantled entirely. He contrasted the rogue behavior of ICE with the plight of TSA agents. He pointed out that while ICE continues to operate and its agents are being paid, TSA workers at airports like Boston Logan, where Mr. Damas used to live, have gone 40 days without a paycheck.
He's trying to decouple the two. The Republican strategy has been to keep DHS funding in one big bucket. If you want to pay the TSA agents and the Coast Guard, you have to fund ICE and the border wall. Espaillat and the Progressive Bloc are now pushing the Drain ICE Act, which would essentially strip away what they call ICE's slush fund and separate it from the rest of the DHS budget. They want to vote on TSA funding as a standalone issue.
Wait, let's look at the actual quote from the record on this, because Representative Pressley didn't hold back on why she thinks the funding is being linked this way. She said, "The Trump administration does not care about protecting our workers or serving the traveling public. This is all a ploy for power and pushing an inhumane agenda against our immigrant neighbors." She then explicitly referenced Project 2025, claiming that the plan all along was to move toward privatizing TSA screening while expanding the footprint of private detention contractors like CoreCivic.
And she used a phrase that has become a bit of a rallying cry for the left in these debates. She said, "The cruelty is truly the point." That is a very specific framing. She's not just saying the system is inefficient or underfunded. She's arguing that the lack of medical care for people like Mr. Damas is a feature of the system, not a bug. The logic being that if detention is miserable and dangerous, it serves as a deterrent to future asylum seekers.
That's a heavy charge to put into the Congressional Record. To balance that, you have to look at the other side of the ledger. Republicans, and even some moderate Democrats, would argue that the surge in detention is a direct response to the record numbers of people crossing the border. If you have 71,000 people in custody, the administrative and medical burden is massive. They'd say the solution is more funding for staff and facilities, not less.
But the counter-argument from people like Representative Nanette Barragan, a Democrat from California, is that the money is already there. It's just being mismanaged by these private contractors. Barragan also took the floor yesterday, Thursday, to talk about a recent visit to the Dilley facility in Texas. She didn't talk about a death, but she talked about a 5-year-old boy named Gale who she met there.
I saw that in the transcript. She described him as totally bloated because he hadn't had a bowel movement in 8 days. She claimed that the medical staff at Dilley, another private facility, just gave him laxatives and dismissed him. She used the term child prisons. It's the same theme: medical neglect as a symptom of a profit-driven system.
It's interesting how these specific medical anecdotes, a toothache, constipation, are being used to bridge the gap between abstract budget numbers and the human reality. When you say $75 billion for ICE, it's hard for the average person to visualize. When you say a man died of a toothache because they wouldn't give him an antibiotic, it becomes a much more potent political weapon.
And it's having a real effect on the floor. Representative Ansari wasn't just there to vent. She was there to demand a specific list of items, a full independent investigation into Damas's death, the release of the medical examiner's report, and a complete timeline of his care. She's also pushing for the release of another constituent of hers, a woman named Yari, who has leukemia and is currently in ICE detention.
The leukemia case is a ticking clock for Ansari. She's essentially saying, we have the blueprint of how Mr. Damas died. We see the same patterns of neglect with Yari. If she dies, it's on the hands of the people who refuse to separate this funding. It's a very high-stakes form of legislative leverage.
It also highlights a shift in how Democrats are talking about ICE. A few years ago, the Abolish ICE movement was mostly relegated to the furthest left edges of the party. But looking at the record from yesterday, Thursday, you have senior members like Espaillat and Barragan using terms like untamed and disgusting and calling for the agency to be dismantled. This isn't just a fringe position anymore. It's becoming the baseline for the House Progressive Caucus in these shutdown negotiations.
The question is where this leaves the broader DHS bill. If you have a solid block of 50 or 60 progressives who are a hell no on any ICE money, and you have a Republican majority that refuses to pass a bill without it, the shutdown isn't ending anytime soon. The TSA agents at Logan Airport and the FEMA workers waiting for disaster funds are caught in the middle of a debate that has now become a referendum on the life and death of a single Haitian man in Arizona.
And the irony, as Espaillat pointed out, is that the administration is adding even more friction to the fire. He mentioned that the president has insisted on adding the SAVE Act to the shutdown negotiations. That's the bill that requires proof of citizenship to register to vote. Espaillat called it a dastardly effort to suppress voters that has nothing to do with the airports or TSA.
It really is a case of two completely different worlds colliding on the House floor. One side is talking about a man dying of a toothache in a private prison, and the other side is talking about the integrity of the 2026 elections and the need for more detention beds to manage a border crisis. There's no common language there.
None at all, and the rhetoric is only getting more personal. Representative Presley closed her remarks by talking about her own experience as a survivor of sexual violence, connecting the silence and shame of survivors to the silence she says ICE forces on detainees. She said, "I believe them if their voice shakes. I believe them if it happened decades ago." She's framing the struggle for detention oversight as part of a broader fight for dignity and against what she calls small and broken abusers of power.
When the debate reaches that level of emotional and moral weight, the chance for a clean funding bill, the kind Espaillat was calling for, seems almost impossible. The middle ground has essentially disappeared.
It has. And while the politicians argue over the Drain ICE Act and the SAVE Act, the family of Emmanuel Damas is still waiting for his body to be repatriated to Haiti. They've hired lawyers to look into the local arrest in Boston that started this whole chain of events, questioning why a well-being check led to a federal detention center thousands of miles away.
That's the detail that often gets lost in the high-level budget fights. The local to federal handoff. Whether it's through the Boston Police Department or the Suffolk County Sheriff's database, these systems are automated. Once that fingerprint hits the system, the individual path is often set, regardless of whether the original reason for the contact was a crime or just a neighbor worried about someone's health.
Exactly. And once you're in that system, as Representative Ansari's floor speech illustrated, the ability of your elected representatives to check on your welfare is surprisingly limited, especially when private contractors and their lawyers are the ones standing at the gate.
It's a reminder that the Congressional Record isn't just a transcript of laws being made. Sometimes it's the only place where these names, Emmanuel, Damas, Gale, Yari, actually get recorded in the halls of power. It's a form of witness as much as it is a legislative debate.
Which brings us directly to the other major battle happening on the floor yesterday, Thursday. And it's one that connects that immigration debate to the very mechanics of how people get to the ballot box in the first place. If you look at the transcript from yesterday, Thursday, there is a significant clash developing over how the administration is handling international energy sanctions. It really comes down to a tale of two different regions and two very different sets of rules. On one hand, you have Representative Greg Landsman, a Democrat from Ohio, taking the floor to call out a new set of waivers that benefit Russian oil giants. Since we have a bit more room to pull these threads together today, it is worth looking at the specific companies involved, Gazprom and Rosneft. These aren't just names on a ledger. They are the backbone of the Russian energy sector, and the administration just gave them a 30-day window to keep the oil flowing into the global market, despite existing sanctions.
The administration's logic here is strictly domestic, or at least that is the official line. They are pointing to the volatility in global energy markets, particularly with the ongoing friction between Israel and Iran, which has put a massive strain on U.S. gas prices. The idea is that by allowing Gazprom and Rosneft to continue their shipments for this temporary window, they can inject some stability into the market and keep prices from spiking further for American drivers. But Landsman's argument yesterday, Thursday, was that this economic relief comes with a staggering moral price tag. He is focusing on a report that came out earlier this week from the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which links these specific Russian companies to something much darker than just energy production.
That Yale report is harrowing. It details the systematic deportation and what they call the patriotic education of Ukrainian children. Landsman was very direct about this on the floor. He said, and I'm quoting the record here, "These companies are helping to steal children, and Trump just helped them out. They will make billions of dollars. In the coming days, we will work to rally Congress to compel Trump to reverse these sanctions. Every single person responsible for stealing Ukrainian children must be held accountable."
The numbers in that report are what really drive the point home. We are talking about 35,000 children moved from occupied territories into Russia and other controlled areas. The report specifically identifies Gazprom and Rosneft as entities that funded and facilitated these camps. The children are reportedly being subjected to militarized training and pro-Russian propaganda. So the analytical disconnect here is that the Treasury Department is treating these companies as essential market stabilizers, while the State Department and human rights investigators are labeling them as active participants in crimes against humanity. Landsman is essentially saying that saving 5 cents at the pump isn't worth subsidizing the infrastructure of child abduction.
That friction over Russian oil becomes even more pronounced when you look at the House's other major foreign policy debate from yesterday, Thursday. Representative Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota, took the floor to address a completely opposite approach the administration is taking regarding Cuba. While the administration is loosening the grip on Russian oil to help global supply, they have spent the last few months tightening a literal blockade on oil heading to Cuba. Omar characterized this as a form of economic warfare, and if you look at the conditions on the island right now, it is hard to find a different word for it. Cuba is currently experiencing its worst energy crisis in decades.
The timeline is important here. Back in January, the administration moved to block Venezuelan oil exports, which has historically been Cuba's primary source of fuel. Cuba only produces about 40% of the energy it needs domestically, so they are incredibly vulnerable to these kinds of shipping disruptions. Because of the U.S. blockade, and the threat of retaliation against any third-party country that tries to send tankers to Havana, the island has been hit by multiple nationwide blackouts just in this month of March. When the lights go out there, it isn't just an inconvenience, it's a total systemic failure.
Omar spent her time on the floor yesterday, Thursday, highlighting the human consequences of those failures. She said the oil blockade enacted by the Trump administration is cruel and indefensible. Cuba poses no threat to us, yet we are strangling an entire nation with economic warfare. Families are going without food. Water systems are failing. Hospitals are struggling to stay open. She's pointing to the fact that without fuel for generators, surgeons are working by flashlight, and water pumping stations are literally seizing up. It's a policy of maximum pressure, and Omar is arguing that the primary victims are Cuban civilians who have no say in the government's actions.
There is a very clear strategic goal behind the pressure, though. If you listen to Secretary of State Marco Rubio or other officials in the administration, they are quite open about the fact that they are trying to trigger a regime change. They believe that by making life untenable on the island, the population will eventually rise up. But the disconnect that Omar is highlighting is the asymmetry. We are granting sanctions waivers to Russian companies allegedly involved in the abduction of thousands of children because we want to lower gas prices in Ohio. But we are preventing a hospital in Havana from getting the fuel needs to run a ventilator because we want to force a political shift in the Caribbean.
It's that divergence in logic that seems to be fueling the frustration on the House floor.
Landsman ended his remarks by promising to lead a legislative effort to force the administration to reverse those Russian waivers. He is looking for a bipartisan coalition that values human rights over temporary energy market stability. Meanwhile, Omar is calling for an immediate end to the blockade, framing it as a matter of basic human dignity. Both members are essentially asking the same question. What are the ethics of our energy policy? The House record from yesterday, Thursday, suggests that as long as the administration keeps shifting the rules based on the map, this debate is only going to get louder. The record from yesterday, Thursday, shows a massive shift in how the House is approaching federal oversight. We saw multiple members, specifically from the Republican side, outlining what looks like a coordinated, government-wide offensive against fraud. Representative Dan Muser, a Republican from Pennsylvania, took to the floor to frame this as a reclamation project for the federal budget.
Muser dropped some numbers that really stop you in your tracks. He cited Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Dr. Mehmet Oz, who is currently leading the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, claiming that between 10 and 20% of the federal budget is being lost to fraud every single year. If you're doing the math on a multi-trillion-dollar budget, that is an eye-watering amount of capital just vanishing into the ether.
It certainly sets the stage for the task force to eliminate fraud. This was established by executive order back on March 16, 2026, and it's chaired by Vice President J.D. Vance. Muser described it yesterday as a critical step towards restoring accountability. And since we have the room to really look at the mechanics of this, it's not just a study group. The executive order gives this task force teeth across a dozen agencies: Justice, Treasury, Health and Human Services, even Housing and Urban Development.
The teeth part is interesting because the record highlights a move toward uniform anti-fraud controls. Usually these agencies operate in silos, but the task force is pushing for expanded data sharing between the federal government and the states. Muser mentioned his subcommittee is already working with HUD Secretary Scott Turner to look at mismanagement in public housing agencies. They're specifically looking at outdated IT systems that they claim allowed criminals to exploit these programs during the previous administration.
And that leads us to the most contentious part of the discussion yesterday, which is where this federal oversight intersects with state politics. Representative James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky and chairman of the Oversight Committee, gave a detailed update on their state-by-state investigations. He started with Minnesota, and he was very direct about targeting the administration of Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat from Minnesota.
Comer, rhetoric on Minnesota, was particularly sharp. He claimed that 9 whistleblowers, career state employees, came forward to testify about welfare fraud. According to the transcript, Comer stated, "We concluded that both Attorney General Keith Ellison and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz knew about the massive amounts of fraud in the welfare programs in Minnesota, yet did nothing about it, and in some instances retaliated against the state employees who did the right thing and came forward."
That's a heavy allegation to put into the Congressional Record. The committee had a hearing on this back in January, and it seems they're using the Minnesota case as a template. They're doing transcribed interviews, building reports, and then handing that over to the Department of Justice. But yesterday, Comer signaled that the spotlight is moving west, specifically to California.
The California focus is on hospice care, which is a fascinating, if grim, detour in this investigation. Comer pointed to Los Angeles County as a primary site of concern. He cited audit data showing that one single county, LA, accounted for 18% of the total federal billing for hospice in the entire country. Think about that. One county out of thousands, representing nearly a fifth of the national spend.
It sounds statistically improbable on its face, which is exactly why the committee is digging in. Comer mentioned that there are thousands of registered providers in LA, billing for hundreds of patients that investigators simply cannot find. He called it a massive hospice fraud scheme. He's actually inviting people in California to look at how they protected the Minnesota whistleblowers as an incentive to come forward.
There's a clear strategy here of focusing on poorly run states, which is the phrase Comer used. It's hard not to see the political geography. Minnesota and California are both led by high-profile Democrats who have been vocal critics of the current administration. By framing the fraud as a failure of state-level management, the Oversight Committee is essentially putting those governors on the hook for billions in federal losses.
That's the pushback you often hear from the other side of the aisle, that these investigations are more about political messaging than fiscal responsibility. However, the numbers being discussed in the record are objective audit figures. Whether it's the result of negligence or just the sheer difficulty of monitoring thousands of private providers, the money is moving out of the Treasury.
And the legislative response is already moving. We saw the Committee on Oversight and Accountability mark up bills like the Federal Program Integrity and Fraud Prevention Act last week. That bill would bar anyone convicted of fraud from getting a federal contract for 3 years. It's a broader effort to create a blacklist for federal funds.
Muser also touched on a field hearing held in Little Rock, Arkansas, led by Representative French Hill, a Republican from Arkansas. They're trying to show that this isn't just a DC problem, but something that has local witnesses. The goal seems to be creating a mountain of testimony that the Vance task force can use to justify major policy shifts in how grants and benefits are distributed.
It's a high-stakes play. If the task force actually manages to claw back even a fraction of that 20% they're targeting, it changes the entire budgetary conversation for the next fiscal year. But it also sets up a long-term legal battle over state versus federal authority in administering these programs.
The phrase Muser used to close his remarks was that he plans to work with the task force to protect taxpayers and work to drain the swamp. It's a callback to a very familiar theme, but with a new, data-driven focus on state-run benefit programs. As these investigations move from Minnesota to California, the pressure on those state administrations is only going to increase. But while the Oversight Committee looks at where the money went, other members are focused on making sure the remaining federal funds are prioritized for very specific groups. We're moving into our final stretch for the day. And while the major headlines usually hog the microphone, the legislative lightning round is where you really see the sheer variety of what crosses the desk in the House and Senate. Yesterday, Thursday, was a particularly dense day for these smaller but no less intense floor moments.
It's that mix of hyperlocal disaster and high-level ideological friction. Since we're digging into the corners of the record from yesterday, I think we have to start in Hawaii, where the numbers coming out of the recent storms are finally starting to take shape.
Representative Jill Takuda, a Democrat from Hawaii, was on the floor for 5 minutes yesterday describing what she called the most catastrophic flooding the state has seen in over 20 years. Two back-to-back storms, these Kona lows, basically parked themselves over the islands. The record reflects a request for a major disaster declaration to handle what is now estimated at over $1 billion in infrastructure damage.
$1 billion. That is massive for a state of that size. What really stood out in the transcript of her speech was this shift in how they're talking about disaster prep. She said, "We grew up preparing for hurricane season. That was a threat that we knew. Now disasters don't wait their turn." She's pointing out that Hawaii is moving from seasonal threats to year-round volatility. Wildfires one month, historic floods the next.
And she was very specific about the why behind the damage. It wasn't just lots of rain. She described roads being ripped apart because storm drains were literally too small to contain the surge. She mentioned fields being flattened because water jumped the banks of overgrown ditches. It's a classic infrastructure gap. The systems were built for 1980s rain, and they're getting 2026 deluges.
She's calling for a whole-of-government response. And we're not just talking about FEMA trailers. She specifically requested the Army Corps of Engineers for dredging and the EPA for soil testing to make sure farm runoff didn't contaminate the groundwater. It's a heavy lift, especially with the state already reeling from those prior wildfires.
While Tokuda was focused on water, Senator Alex Padilla, a Democrat from California, was focused on wages. He introduced a resolution of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act yesterday, Thursday, to overturn a new Department of Labor rule that changes how farm worker pay is calculated.
This is a big technical fight over the adverse effect wage rate. The Department of Labor recently shifted the methodology for H-2A visa workers, and Padilla is sounding the alarm. He called it, and I'm quoting the record here, one of the largest wealth transfers from workers to employers in the history of American agriculture. He estimates it moved $2 billion annually out of workers' pockets.
He broke down the math for several states. In California, he says wages could drop from $20 an hour to under $17. In Michigan, from $18 down to $14. And in Georgia, from $16 to under $11. That is a life-altering pay cut for people doing some of the most grueling labor in the country.
The procedural part of this is where Padilla gets really pointed. He's alleging a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. He argues the Department of Labor rushed this through as an interim final rule, which essentially bypasses the standard public comment period. His line was, cutting wages first and asking questions later.
It's a direct challenge to the administration's handling of labor standards. And speaking of challenges to the administration, Representative George Latimer, a Democrat from New York, took to the floor for 1 minute yesterday to address what's happening at the Pentagon. He specifically targeted Secretary Pete Hegseth's personnel moves.
Latimer didn't hold back. He claimed that 6 high-ranking female leaders, generals, admirals, commandants, have been forced out. He linked this directly to Secretary Hegseth's public skepticism about women in combat roles. Latimer's argument is that this is creating a systemic barrier at the exact moment the military is facing a historic recruitment crisis.
The record shows Latimer also referenced executive orders that are changing physical evaluation standards and harassment reporting. He framed it as a choice to discourage half the population from serving. It's a tension we've seen building for weeks, especially with that ongoing Pentagon review of women in infantry and armor units.
It's a stark contrast to the rhetoric we heard later in the day during a special order session led by Representative Keith Self, a Republican from Texas. This was the formal introduction of the Sharia-Free America Caucus.
This session was intense. Representative Self, along with several colleagues like Representative Chip Roy of Texas and Representative Randy Fine of Florida, spent an hour arguing that Sharia law is a totalitarian ideology that is actively infiltrating the U.S. through separatist enclaves.
The details in the record are very specific to North Texas. Representative Self cited a development in his district called The Meadow, which he said was originally called Epic City. He described it as a 400-acre Muslim-centric community designed to enforce religious codes rather than assimilate into American law. He even mentioned rumors of unattended deaths within these communities not being reported to state authorities.
The rhetoric from the other members was equally sharp. Representative Richard Hudson, a Republican from North Carolina, brought up a case in his district where a teenager pledged allegiance to ISIS. Representative Buddy Carter, a Republican from Georgia, compared the situation to Europe, saying our allies across the pond have fallen to mass immigration.
They've got a whole legislative package tied to this. Bills to designate the Muslim Brotherhood and CARE as terrorist organizations, and a push to ensure no U.S. court ever considers foreign religious codes. It's a significant faction. Representatives self-announced they already have 60 members from 25 different states.
It's a world away from the floor speech by Representative Amelia Sykes, a Democrat from Ohio, who was marking the 16th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. But even there, the tone was urgent. She was focused on the subsidy cliff, the expiration of those enhanced tax credits back on January 1st.
Sykes mentioned that 90% of her ACA-enrolled constituents use those credits. Before they expired, 4 out of 5 of them could find plans for $10 or less a month. Now, she's reading accounts from people whose premiums have jumped by hundreds of dollars. She's calling it a choice between groceries and prescriptions.
The record indicates she's pushing for a vote on legislation to restore those credits. But with the current House majority, that's a steep climb. It's part of that larger healthcare debate that seems to be reigniting as we head toward the midterms.
And finally, we should look at the paperwork side of things. 39 new public bills were introduced yesterday, Thursday. Everything from H.R. 8103, which would prohibit military funds for use in Cuba, to H.R. 8123, which aims to ban prediction markets from offering event contracts, basically betting on political outcomes.
One of the most significant among those is H.R. 8092, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Modernization Act. It's a bipartisan bill led by Representative Troy Downing, a Republican from Montana, and Representative Angie Craig, a Democrat from Minnesota. This is huge because that act hasn't been fully reauthorized since 2008, despite being the primary vehicle for tribal housing.
17 years is a long time to go without an update, especially with the housing crisis in tribal communities. The bill includes regulatory relief and updates for the Indian Housing Block Grant Program. It's one of those rare moments of broad bipartisan consensus, hidden in a list of 39 bills.
We also saw H.R. 8094, which would require the Federal Trade Commission to force AI companies to be transparent about the training data and algorithms used in foundation models. That's coming from Representative Dawn Beyer, a Democrat from Virginia. It's the first real shot at regulating the black box of AI data.
From AI transparency to tribal housing to flood relief in Hawaii, it's a lot to process in a single day. But that is the nature of the job. Whether it's a high-profile caucus launch or a technical amendment to the Social Security Act, the record captures it all.
And that is where we leave it for this edition of the Lightning Round. That wraps up our coverage of the Congressional Record from Thursday, March 26, 2026.
We'll be back next time to see which of these bills actually makes it out of committee and onto the floor for a vote. There's always a new story in the fine print.
I'm Paige.
And I'm Reed. This has been Floor Notes Extended. Before we wrap, there is one more item from the record we have to mention. In a day filled with talk of $40 billion wars and trillion-dollar debts, the most heated 30 minutes in the House yesterday, Thursday, were actually spent discussing the civilization jihadist threat allegedly posed by an Islamic center in Plano, Texas.
It's a striking contrast in the transcript, especially given the fiscal gravity of the other debates. It really proves that in the 119th Congress, the old rule of thumb has shifted. All politics isn't just local anymore. It has become deeply, often intensely, personal.
Exactly. When you look at the breakdown of the floor time, those 30 minutes tell you more about the current temperature on the Hill than any spending bill ever could. It's the subtext becoming the main text.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back to dig through the record as soon as the House returns to session.